Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. And today I have a wonderful episode with Amanda Churchill, who is the author of this beautiful book, The Turtle House, and it's a beautifully written book. And we have so much to cover, but I want to tell you a little bit about Amanda. She is a writer living in Texas. Her novel, The Turtle House, was inspired by the life of her beloved grandmother, a Japanese war bride. Her work has been featured in Hobart Pulp, Witness, River Styx, and other publications. Amanda is a Writers League of Texas 2021 Fellow. She attended the 2021 Community of Writers Workshop in Fiction as a James D. Houston Memorial Scholarship recipient. Amanda has also attended the Tin House Summer and Winter Conferences, the One Story Summer Workshop, and Storyboard Chicago. She was the Fall 2020 mentee in AWP's Writer to Writer program. And I have to tell you how we connected. I was a mentee for AWP for the winter 2023. And so when we went to the reception, Amanda was there, and I think she had maybe recognized me, or we were mutually introduced, and we started talking. And she said, I have a book coming out, and she gave me her postcard. And I said, absolutely, send it to me. And also somebody spoke very highly of her who was there at the conference from AWP. And I'm going to be a mentee again in the creative nonfiction realm, which I love doing. And I love going to AWP, and it was so wonderful to meet Amanda. And then I read her book and just consumed it. And so let's get into it. So first of all, you're not a writer by trade, although you are a lovely literary writer who really employs metaphor and wonderful lyricism in your writing. So can you talk about your trade?
Well, I'm a graphic designer. I've done that for many, many years. It is, gosh, I don't know how long I've done it since I graduated from college. I took a little time off and taught English in high schools for a little bit, and then realized that all the people around me all the time, even though I loved the kids, it was a bit much. So I had to step back and go back to graphic design. So yes, I've done it for a long time. It's a fun job, and it's something that's visual and it's artistic, but it doesn't get in the way of my writing brain. So I've been able to handle both for many years. I graduated 2009 from University of North Texas with a master's in creative writing. So it's kind of, I've just balanced it.
That's amazing that you balanced it and so well. And it's so interesting because they always say, write what you know, right? Even though you novelized it, this is, to all extents and purposes, your grandmother's story. And I don't want to give the whole book away. But she had a past and a past love, and it informed her life as your grandmother. And the protagonist of the story, who is also like an architect. So she's not a graphic designer per se, but she's an architect. And you've built in so much drama into the story, which kept me engrossed in it. For example,
Thank you.
your protagonist, Leah, and her the beau of your grandmother was a keto. Leah is dealing with a lot of stresses in her life, and she's dealing with a lot of conflicts, things on the job, stuff that she's doing, and professors and things like that. And her grandmother notices that she's really stressed more than anybody else in her family. Her grandmother has like a direct line into her.
Mhm.
Were you very close with your grandmother?
I was and I wasn't. It's very interesting because we lived in such close proximity. We were around each other a lot. And where my other grandmother, my mom's mom, was the grandmother that baked cookies and braided my hair and took me shopping and kind of just clucked over me. My dad's mom was more distant. So it was like I was around her and I was kind of like a little obsessed with her because she was a little more mysterious to me and a little more distant. And she would say funny things that would kind of get me like, oh, what does she mean by that? And I think she was very intriguing. And as I got older and I came into my own and I was, married and pregnant with my first child, we became a lot closer. So it was an interesting relationship. I tried many times to be super close to her, and either she wasn't ready for it or I wasn't ready for it, but we were always in the same physical space, which is what's so funny.
That's interesting. And so is Leah and her grandmother.
Mhm.
And, you talk about the cultural divide and
Uh-huh.
in terms of her background, and then Leah, who is so thoroughly Americanized. So can you
Right.
kind of conflate that with your own situation with your grandmother?
Yes, exactly. I think I knew so little about my grandmother's history, and because of that, the culture that goes along with that, I just made guesses as to how she was feeling and thinking when really I was looking at it from a very Americanized Texas 1990s, raised in kind of like a small town perspective. And I think that that was something I had to learn to not do. And then the research and just the talking to her about her life really opened up who she was to me. And there was a
She's
slight
from
let
Japan, right?
she's from
She's from
Japan.
Japan, and she was
Yep.
was she a war bride like Mineko is in the
Yes,
story?
she was definitely a war bride. She came to the US in the late 50s with her husband, which is my grandfather, and 4 kids. And it was a huge challenge and a huge change for her. And she learned English from the kids going to school. And that was her perspective. And because of that language barrier, her language skills, were taught to her by 6 and 7 and 8 year olds. And so they progressed, but not drastically because she was just working and doing her thing. She worked in a state school for many years with adults who were generally nonverbal. So it wasn't like she was practicing her skills that much there either. And so there was that situation that was, we would talk and we would have misunderstandings. And then just culturally, the way she saw the world and the way I saw the world.
And
So
how did she see the world?
she was tough. She was, I was emotional Texas teen, like, oh, oh my gosh, this is so awful. And she was like, oh, no big deal. Everything was no big deal. Everything was fine. She had seen so much and done so much in her life that it would have to really be awful to wreck her. And I'd seen that a few times when my dad's oldest sister passed away. I could definitely see the pain there, but it was kind of the first time I had seen that pain. She was someone who bore her burdens and her trauma so well that you almost couldn't tell that she had been through so much.
It's
So,
like buck up sissy pants, right?
exactly.
So this story of Mineko and this past love of hers, who is
Mhm.
not your grandfather, not
Right.
the grandfather
Yes.
in the book, was touched by tragedy.
Mhm.
You built out the tragedy, which I'm not going to give away, but you built out the tragedy in the pages of the book, which
Mhm.
is good because it's not like what happened, what happened. We do end up learning what happened at the end. And so, was her situation your grandmother's situation? Maybe you can talk about this photograph that she had with her.
I'm going to try to do it without giving it away. Well, my grandmother, I interviewed her in 2009, and at that time she had slowed down quite a bit in her life. She had had a cancer diagnosis. I was slowing down a little bit because I had left my full-time job. I was finishing up my master's degree thesis, and I was trying to get everything ready because I was about to have a baby. I was like, okay, this is about to happen. My life's about to change. Let's get all of our ducks in a row. And as I was getting ducks in a row, my dad called and said, listen, she's not doing well. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. She might be okay, she might not, but I want to know her life story. I feel like I don't know her life story as well. And would you mind going over there? I think she'd answer the questions for you. And I was like, oh gosh, daddy. I mean, it's like felt like an impossible task. I'm like, oh, why don't you just climb a mountain while you're pregnant, Amanda? Like, it's cool, you can do it. But I love my parents and I love my daddy. I'm a daddy's girl. So I went to Barnes and Noble and I bought this book, and it was like for kids. It's like questions for my grandparents. And I mean, very cheesy. So I was like, okay, here's the bare bones of it. I'll get her talking and maybe I can get her to explain more. So I started going over there about once a week, usually on the weekends. And she lived out in Ponder, Texas. I lived in Fort Worth at the time, so it was a good 45-minute drive out there. And I would sit in her house and ask her questions. And she was like a reluctant movie star, like someone who didn't want to answer. And we'd talk for a little bit. I'd ask her a question. She'd kind of halfway answer it. And she'd light a cigarette, which she was a chronic smoker. And I was like pregnant. And did I want to be on cigarette smoke? No. But did I have a choice in that one? No. I was like, okay, baby, just hold your breath. And she would watch her Japanese satellite television. She watched sumo a lot and she watched a lot of Japanese soap operas. And after that, after 15, 20 minutes, she'd look at me and go, okay, I answer now. And I'd be, okay, here we go. And she would get into it and I'd ask her some questions and I'd pull a little bit more, but it was like pulling taffy. It was like pulling teeth, as my mom would say. It was so hard at times. And at the time, I was like, is she just being difficult or does she not want to tell me? And later on, after I don't know, I was at the age I'd been through some stuff, but not as much as I have like from 2020 on. Now I realize, oh, that was a trauma response. I was sitting with a woman who was traumatized. So we would chat for a while and then she would tell me more of her story. And I've slowly filled up this book with stories and recorded her sometimes and kept it. And what I learned was amazing. And about her past, she said that she had one boyfriend that she really loved. They were engaged to be married. He was drafted into the war, and she looked at me, he died. And that was it. I was like, "What- is that all I get?" And she was like, oh yeah, he died. It was very sad. I loved him lots. He was very funny and kind of nerdy and scared of lots of little crazy things. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. He was probably more, I could see him being more like maybe even timid because she was such a kind of a
Worse.
beast of a human. And I was like, oh, that does sound like a kind of a good match, actually. And then she just moved on from it. And so I moved on from it thinking, well, maybe it wasn't such a big deal. Maybe it was like that first high school boyfriend and she's over it. But years later, in 2014, when she was about to go into hospice care, she was 91. She was still lucid enough to talk to the family. She told my dad and my aunt that she wanted to be cremated with a certain photo. And they for some reason they didn't question it as much, or maybe my dad didn't question it as much and my aunt June knew a little bit more. It's like that's that daughter son difference. So she did pass away, and I got the phone call one evening. I had a newborn again, and my dad was like, listen, she's gone, stay home, don't come up to the assisted living. Your mom and I and Aunt June and Uncle Bill are here, just stay there. She loved you very much. And hung up the phone. Not 10 seconds later, my phone rings again, and it's my mom and my Uncle Bill are out in the hallway of the assisted living. So you've got the kids in the room with their mother who has passed, and then the outlaws in the family. Got the sister-in-law and brother-in-law out in the hallway, and mom was like, you will not believe what that photo was. You will not believe. And I was like, well, what? And I hear Uncle Bill saying, tell her, Debbie. And I was like, oh, what was it? And it was a photo of this young man that she had loved. And they had found it in her underwear drawer. And I was like, Mama, take a photo. So she took a photo with her phone, which was not a fabulous photo. And they put it with my grandmother and they cremated her with it. And I wish in retrospect I had put on some house shoes and drove to the assisted living and taken it to Walgreens and like scanned it or something. I wish I'd done something more so you could have a better version of it. But in the photo, there was a young man. He had glasses. It looked like he was in a war uniform. He did not look pleased at all. It was kind of, he looked scared actually in the photo. And he had a big fancy hat on it, like a stool next to him. That's like with a big plume on it. And I was like, well, what the heck? It was like a very ceremonial photo. And I remember it to this day. I'll never forget what it looked like, the tone of the sepia, and that she had carried it for so long with her, and that's what she wanted.
Wow.
So,
There's so many through lines that
mhm.
run through your story. So, I mean, Turtle House. Can you explain what that represents?
Well, I think when I was writing it, I always wanted a place for my grandmother to live, especially when she was moved into an assisted living. I was like, how lovely would it be for her to have one chance of like living in a home that's a Japanese home, something that looks on the outside the way she felt on the inside. And it just kind of kept with that stayed with me. And so when I wrote the novel, I wanted to give the characters that gift. And so when Mineko is young, she has like this estate that she runs off to that's abandoned and kind of plays there and hangs out. And a lot of her life and a lot of her learning happens in this one spot. And then Leah, as an architect, gets to know this place through her grandmother's stories and really wants to help make her grandmother's dreams come true. So it was just a wonderful way to give people that I love a happy ending in fashion that I couldn't give them in real life.
It's like home. It's like
Oh, it's a
searching for
home.
a home and finding a home, and
Right.
also the meaning of what turtles meant. It didn't mean home and like that they live a long life,
It
right?
meant long, it mean in Japanese culture means longevity and good fortune and good luck. And you'll see them a lot on different, screens and artwork. You'll see the turtles. I have a Minogami necklace on. But the turtle itself has like it's like a mythic turtle and it has like a funky little tail that kind of swoops off the back of it. It's supposed to look like moss. If you've ever seen a mossy back turtle swimming in a pond,
Yes.
it's supposed to look like an old mossy back turtle that's had a long, fabulous life. And there was just something about that imagery that really spoke to me about getting to live somewhere, have a long, happy life. And when I was a kid, I used to think that turtles, they would tuck their heads into their shells and it would be like the cartoons, like they had like their home inside their shell. Like there'd be like a mantle and a fireplace and a television set. And something about being able to tuck into your own body and feel safe and secure also is just an image that I kind of kept with me. So,
That's yes, the way that the turtles carry home on their back. And sort
hmm
of the grandmother in the book, Miniko,
hmm
she's kind of carrying the idea of this home. And that's why she's able to portray it to
hmm
Leia, which is so
right.
fascinating. And so there's other through lines also through the book. It's sort of like, there's the idea of prettiness
hmm
because the grandmother kind of she has a beautiful mother and
hmm
sister, and then
right.
she's portrayed as ugly, but it's really in the heart is how
hmm
you view someone, and the way that she's viewed is not that way at all. And I think she
mm
learns to view herself in a different way through seeing how somebody else views her. Would you?
right. I
Yeah.
would definitely agree. And I would say that my own grandmother did feel plain compared to her sister and was told that she was more plain by her own mother. And so she carried that sadness with her. And it almost became kind of like, well, I'm plain, so it's no big deal, like a defense mechanism. And but when you carry that kind of sadness with you, I think other people might take advantage of it. And I think that was what happened with when my grandmother met my grandfather. He took advantage of her self-esteem in some areas.
That's interesting. Was your grandfather similar to the grandfather in the
Yes.
book? Yes. Okay.
Definitely. Yeah. My grandfather was, I mean, not to mince words, he was abusive. And I grew up knowing this. I'd never met him,
Okay.
but because I saw the rift or just the trauma within the kids, my dad and his sisters, and how they looked at their own past and how it affected their future. My dad is a wonderful, wonderful man. He's a great dad, but he was sad at times and anxious and depressed at times, and my aunts were as well. And I was always wondering, what is this that we're carrying? And when I realized it was my grandfather, I I mean, I had
So
a certain amount of hate for him.
no, that makes sense. So let me ask you this. You made the decision to write this as a novel. Why did you make that decision to novelize it as opposed to do it straight memoir?
There was a certain aspect of protection. I did want to protect the people who were victimized. The victimizer, that's on him. There was choices made. But
Right.
my aunts and my dad who had gone through so much, I did not want to open wounds in a way that would be uncomfortable. And so not all of my aunts are portrayed in the book. I kind of make one character out of three women. My father is a caricature or a close replica of my father. And so there was that aspect of it. Also, being a quarter Japanese, I didn't want to give anyone the false narrative that I knew everything about Japan, that I knew everything about the culture, because I didn't. My Japanese culture is very much Japan within a small town in Texas. Like, this is the piece of pie that I received. And so I wanted to be able to explore that without fear of being called out on the carpet, like, well, that's wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
so that kind of gave me a little more freedom. And then there was just chunks of my grandmother's story that I did not know. For all my questions, when I was writing this out, originally her historical part, I was writing it out, in third person. I would get to a big point and I'd be like, well, what happened then? And she was already gone. I couldn't ask. And I was like, oh, son of a gun, I have a hole. And the only way to keep going was to guess and make it up, do the best I could, and kind of get over that hole in the concrete as I was walking down the sidewalk. It was like a gaping hole. I'd, build something over it and then turn back and do the research and make sure whatever I built was correct, or do the research first and then build, just depending on the situation, and then just kept on going. So it's almost like a whole bunch of truths in the novel that are connected by bridges of fiction.
That is a great explanation. That makes so much sense.
Thank
And so
you.
there's so much research involved in this book. And you
Hmm.
know that I love talking about process and structure. What was your process of writing it? I mean, I know you said you did the interviews with her, and that
Hmm.
was before you even probably had the idea for a book. When
Right.
did the idea of the book come to you? And how did you start breaking down? Like, I like the incremental steps of what it takes to write a novel like this.
Well, I started kind of on accident. She had passed away in 2014, and I was, I had a baby, a newborn. I had a 4-year-old. I was feeling a little claustrophobic, maybe, and also very postpartum, if that's like, if we can make that a word. And I was not sleeping, and so there was just a hot mess of stuff going on in my brain. And it felt like the one thing that could make me feel better was to sit down and just write. And I was like, okay, it's hard to come up with new thoughts because I'm so tired. I'm going to open this book of my grandmother's stories and I'm just going to write them. I'm going to start writing them out, typing them out, and use that as like just my information right there. It's almost like building an art project out of like newspaper scraps. Like I'll just build it from this. And that began. And like I said, I kind of put in the fictional parts and I was like, oh my gosh, this has really grown. And before I knew it, I had an entire half of a novel. And I was like, oh my goodness. Okay, well, I need more, I feel like. And I felt like there would needed to be another character in there that could help translate the grandmother's thoughts in like more present day Texas. And so Leah kind of came up in one of these writing sessions, this granddaughter who was kind of an anxious hot mess who, I mean, couldn't figure out what she was doing, was a little disappointed by life. Maybe I was like taking my emotions and sticking them in Leah, probably so. That's how I like to work. And she started popping up in different parts. So I was like, okay, I'll draw her out. And then it became, a story that was like 75% Mineko and then like 25% Leah jumping in there and saying, here's what we're doing and here's what we're planning. And as that went, I had, beta readers look at it and they're like, you know what? I think it needs to be more equal. I think you need to have more Leah and have a little more equal pattern here to make that character stronger. Because right now she is just a prop for Mineko. And I was like, yeah, but I was cool with her being a prop because I'd in my own life, I felt like I'd been a helper for my grandmother. Like maybe that was my role. So they're like, no, let's see if she can stand on her own. So I was like, okay. So I went back in and added more, and in adding more, it made Mineko's story even deeper because you had that juxtaposition of these two women.
You being a graphic designer as well, did that change anything about your process of writing the book out? Like, did you, I don't know, sketch alongside what you were doing to build your characters and make them come to life?
Well, I'm a very visual person. And so when I write, I see it almost like I'm designing. I do a lot of print design still. So a lot of annual reports and books and stuff like that. And when you're doing that, as you're going through chapter to chapter and you're changing, topics, you have to have like one art motif that kind of follows through that ties it together because you want the outsides to mimic the insides and it to all be related. And so when I wrote, I would finish a chapter that was like a Mineko chapter, and I'd be braiding in the Leah chapter, and I would make sure that there was some kind of replication of color, of scent, of a word that would end one and start the other, even if it wasn't very, people couldn't always pick it out. I just felt like there needed to be something there that tied them together to ease that transition because I had read books before that the transition was really sharp and that I was like, okay, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. So let's see if I can help my readers out by kind of ironing out that transition. Kind of like equality in chapter length and making sure that if this is going to be long, then this needs to be a little shorter. If this is going to be short, this needs to be a little longer, and just trying to keep the balance there. So almost like when you're designing a website or a poster or a big something that there's enough white space in between to make the eye go to the right places.
Another through line in your book is self-acceptance, right?
Hmm.
Because grandmother has a temper,
Uh-huh.
but it's accepted by the person who loves her. And
Hmm.
Leia doesn't feel like she's accepted for who she is. And
Hmm.
that becomes part of the journey as well. That becomes an important through line
Hmm.
where, and I love that you say that things are connected, because that's something I talk about in my book about like transitional sentences and if a word can connect at the end of the sentence to the beginning of the next one, that
Hmm.
really brings the reader along. And that is a very visual. And you're also great with metaphor. Like, for example, on page 20, you talk about, I love this line, and daddy is in the center of these two quietly conflicting countries, both wanting him like he's a landlocked valley with considerable natural resources, talking about the conflict between the mom and the grandmother over the father.
Yeah, I love visual language. I love poetry. I love to read poetry. I'm a horrible poet myself, so I don't pretend to be one. But looking at something within a line and looking at the very smallest increments of language are like it's fascinating to me. It's like a game. So it keeps me going when the novel writing gets hard and it's a long road and there's lots of words that need to happen.
How long did this take you to write?
Oh gosh, 10 years. I started in 2014 and it was published in 2024. So I would say 10. I actually wrote it
Oh, wow.
slowly, over many years with, kids and work and life happening in between. I'd write short fiction here and there, but this was my main project. And then around spring of 2019, maybe a little bit before, I realized that I was like, I want this to be a book. It is a book. It needs to be out in the world somehow. It's going to be impossible to get this happening, but my son is going to kindergarten. I'm going to have this space where both children are in school. And I'll be able to divide my time between work and writing and really make this happen. And I vowed to myself that I would throw everything I had behind it. And I did. That's what I did. I started applying for things that I'd always been too scared to apply for. I started taking myself seriously, like very seriously. Like I this is my writing day and nothing's going to get in the way of this. And I would work late the night before getting graphic design work done. I mean, get all the laundry folded, get everything ready for life for that one writing day that I would just stop the world around me and dive in. And I think it took time and me taking myself seriously as a writer.
It's fascinating and engrossing reading, but it has a lot of depth
Mhm. Thank
and
you.
emotion and heart and beautiful language and visual descriptions and depictions. And I could also see that there's a lot of research behind it
Hmm.
because you got historic things that you didn't know. Yes, your grandmother was a Japanese war bride, but you had to build out certain scenes
Right.
that you couldn't get from her by that point. And
Hmm.
maybe she didn't even want to tell you, especially if your grandfather was abusive, like
Hmm.
the grandfather in here in the book. But I believe I read that you found groups on Facebook that,
Yes.
so can you talk a little bit about the research
Yeah.
elements of what you did?
Well, I found some wonderful books that helped me along the way. And what I was really curious about was what was village life like? What would it really look like for my grandmother in the 20s, in the early 30s in Japan and outside of Osaka? And I was having a hard time. I knew what her example of life was, but I wanted to know the texture of the life around her. And I found a great book and it's back there somewhere. I know it's in the acknowledgments, but basically a doctor from a small village in Japan went through many years ago and asked all of the older people what their life stories were. And this was happened in the 80s. And so he was asking people who are in their hundreds back then about what they had experienced and what their job was and what was something that they remembered. And it was kind of like a little view of how a village worked and who did what and what the experiences were. And so that helped build that background knowledge that I needed to make myself feel like secure when I was writing. So that was a big help. Lots of books about occupation, a lot of books about what the Japanese state of mind was after the war, like during the war and after the war, and how all that worked together. And then for base life, I was fascinated because my dad had talked about living on base in Tokyo. They lived on base and then also off base right off of it at Tachikawa. And my grandfather was Army Air Force. So I found on Facebook a Facebook group, and there was everyone from Tachikawa that when it was still open, it was open for many, many years from like 46 all the way into the 70s, people who lived there. And they talked about their experiences and how much they loved it. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So you had to like fill out questions to be part of the group. And I was like, I'm a writer. My dad was born here. I'm interested. And when they let me in, it was just this treasure trove of memories and of photos. Like I was just so shocked that people, had saved all these mementos of their life, scanned them in and put them online. It was stuff like the menus for the officers club and photos of elementary school parties and there was one that just posted recently and I was like, oh, that would have been helpful. What the inside of their grocery store, the PX looked like, and of another store right off base that everyone shopped at. Photos of the stuff they brought home, the dolls and like all of the memorabilia that they brought with them. It was just great. And like I loved seeing photos of street scenes, like because I love photos and I love the faces, but I love the backgrounds behind them. I like to like zoom in Photoshop and see what tea kettle is over their shoulder and what is she really holding? Is it a bear or is it a rabbit? Like all those little details are just so important to me.
I love that. So, for somebody who's writing a novel, maybe for the first time, and maybe doesn't want to take 10 years,
Yeah,
with
it's a long
your
time. I don't recommend it.
with your experience now, how would you recommend going about that?
I think that the main difference in my writing from then and now, because I'm working on another novel and it's come much faster and I'm already in revision process. And I think is honestly, I feel confident. I was not confident at the time. It's so hard to do something in life when you don't believe in yourself or that you're actually going to get somewhere. I think that's what took some time. That and it really was the busiest time of life as a young mother. But taking myself seriously, providing myself the time and being confident that I'm doing something. I'm doing something and it's going to be as great as I can make it. I think that's the big difference.
So, do you have any tips for like dealing with the intensity of emotion that comes up when you're writing a novel or, something that's set in like family history? even if it's a memoir for someone. How do you navigate that?
Well, I've had a lot of therapy, like a lot of therapy. And so there's that. I have like that nice basis of how to handle my emotions and my thoughts and work through them. So that's a very expensive process. I think the other thing that has helped me is as I write, a lot of times I have a kind of like a sister document that I'm writing about the writing. And I will employ it when I'm struggling with a scene or if I don't know what I'm doing or I've written myself into a corner and I just want to give up.
Wait,
I
wait, wait.
can
Break this down. This is fascinating. You have a
okay.
sister document.
hmm It's
Explain.
like
Yeah.
it's if you're in therapy, the manuscript is the patient and the sister document is the therapist. And so like like how does that make you feel? Why do you feel this way? Why, what can you do to help this? Are the questions I ask myself as I'm in the sister document. Because I'll get to a point that I'll be like, this doesn't make a lick of sense. I've written myself into a corner. How am I going to get myself out of this? And that anxiety will shut down every thought in my brain. And so that writing about the writing kind of helps me loosen it up, loosen the knot to the point that I can figure my way out of the problem. But a lot of it is just it's free writing and also just asking myself the hard questions like what are you scared of? What is your character scared of? Like what is your best case scenario for this? How do you want this to end? And just asking myself the hard questions. And sometimes my agent will lovingly ask me those questions or my editor and that I'm like, "Oh, thank you. That gives me something to chew on." I need people to ask me the questions. My sweet brain can't always figure it all out. And those outside readers being able to see the piece and see the potholes in it and see where things need to be tightened, that's vital to me.
And since I've lately been having agents on the program, how did you find your agent?
I had gone to a lot of summer writing workshops over the years. I would save up money all year and then apply and see what I get into. And my kids would always call it mom's writing camp. And I'd go off to writing camp for a week and just immerse myself in that life. And they will always, you always meet an agent there. You get an agent meeting as part of your package. And so I'd choose the best agent that I thought, and I'd get ready and introduce myself and do all that kind of stuff. And at the end of each meeting, they say, "This is fascinating. Send me pages when you're done." And so I would like add them to my list, and I'd rank them as like, who I liked best, who I didn't like as much, who I thought was pretty good, and just kept it going, like literally in a spreadsheet in my computer for years. And so when it was time to submit, I had a really great list of agents that either I'd met personally or my friends had met and was like, okay, this is a good person for you. And so that was my first list of agents to send to. Sarah Boland was, of course, on that list. She was at the very top of the list. And when I met her in real life or on screen for Zoom, I just knew that she was the one I wanted to work with. She saw my book the way that I felt it should be, but it wasn't always on the page exactly. Like she could see through my own holes, which I thought was like, "Oh, you're so brilliant. Thank you for being able to see me." And yeah,
That's
it was fabulous. A fabulous experience.
This has been great. Thank you so much for speaking with me, Amanda. Great book. Everyone should get this book. They'll see on for the YouTube version.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I had so much fun. I really appreciate it.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.